Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Big Ideas. My name is Nikki Woods. I'm Director of the Institute for Education Research at UHN, and it is my pleasure to moderate our last session of the academic year. I would first like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we all learn from and with each other. Many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories that precede the establishment of the University Health Network and Michener Institute. For thousands of years, this has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a Black Canadian woman, I take a moment to reflect on the truth that I am able to work and learn here through treaties that were signed before the abolition of Black enslavement in Canada. I appreciate the opportunity that this land affords me today to learn and grow, despite an education and health system built on legacies of colonialism. Legacies that continue to harm and oppress the descendants of the Black diaspora from around the world. I approach today's opportunity to learn with gratitude to my ancestors, but also in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island who continue to resist colonial violence while striving for a more just future. Today, I am particularly grateful for the community of educators and learners and scientists at UHN who are committed to learning and growing and practicing in ways that don't overlook these complicated and unjust histories. Many of us today, we already know our speaker, Dr. Stella Eng. I have had the pleasure of working with Stella for many, many years and have come to appreciate that she's incredibly passionate about exploring those many areas of our everyday experience that can be complicated, and that she's always willing to try to prepare those in healthcare to navigate systems that intentionally and inadvertently perpetuate inequity. Stella's work emphasizes education and practice in ways that can lead to transformation. I'm confident that whatever she shares with us today will inspire us to act collaboratively, to behave compassionately and ethically in the face of uncertainty. Currently, Stella serves as the director of the Center for Advancing Collaborative Healthcare and Education at UHN. She's a scientist at the Wilson Center and at the Institute for Education Research, and is an associate professor in the Department of Speech-Language Pathology at University of Toronto. Although we're all in different spaces today virtually, we really wanted to be able to engage with as many scholars as possible. We're really happy that we have people from around our own organization and many others joining us for Stella's lecture, but we really want it to feel a bit more like a community. So we're hoping that you will open another browser window and click the link that's in your YouTube box at the bottom and participate in the discussion on Slido. So you can, by entering code 10508, you can actually add questions that Stella can address at the end of her presentation. You don't have to wait till the end. You can just jump in and start adding them at any moment. It's one of those nice things about the virtual space is that you can ask a question without interrupting. And at the end of the session, Stella will take the time to add and address as many of them as possible. So I think that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Stella, and thank you again, Stella, for joining.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. A special thanks to Gregory Collins for the amazing coordination work and to Tier for the invitation. And just to confirm with a nod, Nikki, you can see my slide. Great, thank you. So as Nikki said, with no pressure, I'm going to try today to demonstrate the big idea that education can, in fact, address challenges that we face in healthcare. So what exactly are those challenges? Maybe just start thinking in your own mind as you prepare your meal or your coffee there. What are the major current challenges in healthcare? They may not be new challenges, yet they're still current. And I'm going to guess, and I also know based on some literature and conversations, that some of those challenges popping into your head right now relate to things like inequity, a lack of trust that may have been broken, may have been lost, or that may have always been lacking, as well as scarcity of time, of resources, of well-being, of funding. So I'm going to share now a story that comes from my inspiration for why I do this work now, this education research work. I used to practice, and so many of you who have seen my previous talks will have heard stories like this before. I try to hang on to them and continue to work in the space that is full of these stories as a grounding so that we're reminded of why we're doing the work we're doing, which is ultimately to make a more just world. So think of a family. And this family, the parents, are just making ends meet. One of the family's children, their son, is really struggling at school. Teachers are saying that he's really disruptive. In fact, he's starting to bully other children. He can't sit still, among other things. In talking with your family physician, and fortunately you have access to a family physician, certain psychoeducational assessments are recommended, which the parents do go ahead and access and pursue. However, upon receiving the results and the recommendations in reports, written reports, the family chooses not to move further along the path that healthcare and school supports would entail. There seem to be many complexities going on in this family dynamic, much more than it might first seem. And the family physician, the psychologist, and the school-based health professionals like speech-language pathologists feel like they can't push too much. And in fact, maybe they shouldn't push too much, even if all of their schooling, all of their training has taught them about the importance of things like early intervention. So what I've just described is common. This is super common. And it has a name. It has a lot of names now that you've probably heard of people talking about wicked problems, or there's an acronym for VUCA, where the V stands for volatile. The way that I've been talking about this for some time is inspired by Donald Shun. And what it is an indeterminate zone of practice, which makes up the majority of practice. Indeterminate zones of practice are defined as uncertain, unique, unstable, and value conflicted. And in these quite common indeterminate zones of practice, practitioners must engage their reflective practice. We hear a lot about reflection in health professions. I'm talking about a very specific definition and conceptualization today. Reflective practice is based in theories of reflection that come from John Dewey, where reflection was defined as active, persistent, careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and the conclusions to which it tends. So the focus of reflection here is knowledge claims. And when you're continually reflecting, you're doing so before practice, during practice, in the very moments of your actions when you can still make a change to the situation that you're in, and after practice, which tends to be where we focus most in the health professions. It's actually not really the focus of reflective practice, which, if you read Shun's work and others' work, really resides in the moment, in action, in those indeterminate zones. Because it's in those zones when you can engage in your way of being and seeing and doing that is grounded in a commitment to a big piece of jargon here, an epistemology of practice, which just means how knowledge is created and enacted in indeterminate zones of practice. So drawing on your past knowledge and creating new opportunities, new ways forward that fit the situation that you're in. When we add the word critical before reflection, this focuses it. So not on the self, not on just the knowledge claims alone. It adds a layer of questioning individual and societal assumptions and power relations and examining how these shape practice. And when those assumptions and power relations are harmful or problematic, making change. This is critically reflective practice. Victoria Boyd, a graduate student at the Wilson Center, recently alerted me to a quote from one of the founders of critically reflective practice, from Stephen Brookfield. And I thought this quote really drove it home. Critically reflective practitioners realize that their work is rife with contradictions and consequences, of which they are at best only dimly aware. And so when you're critically reflective, you try your best to become more aware. I think there are still limits on just how aware you can become. So with that clarity about what we're talking about, you might be wondering, well, do we really need it? And we've done a lot of work that builds on the work of others who will cite along the way that shows that critically reflective practice is already happening in the real world, and that when it does enable more equitable, compassionate, collaborative healthcare. So here's one example. Back to that story of the family trying to navigate their child's needs, both in terms of health and school. In that context, in one of our qualitative studies, we found that a critically reflective approach to practice allowed people working in that complex, indeterminate zone to get to know one another truly, not to just make assumptions about what the school might do or might not want to do, about what the doctor is thinking, about why the family isn't pursuing the possible supports, truly trying to understand where we're all coming from. And that required a commitment to valuing different forms and sources of knowledge. So a bit of epistemic humility, understanding that there are limits to all sources of knowledge and realizing that even something like personal knowledge might be really, really important, especially in the scenario that I described at the outset. And when that value existed, practitioners in this space and families in this space were able to advocate with and not at. So they took on advocacy in a collaborative fashion rather than assuming that maybe I'm the family doctor and I think, why won't the school do this? Or maybe I'm the parent and I think, why won't the school do this? Realizing probably the school wants what's best. They want the child to succeed and do well and feel included. If we work together towards that as the common goal, that could be more effective than assuming that there's an adversary involved. Because in fact, usually it's sort of a system that is the adversary, not any one teacher or principal. Of course, that can happen. We also saw in this space that critically reflective practice looked like not just creating workarounds, which we all do on an everyday basis. Maybe there's a system or a form that doesn't quite line up with what's needed. So we just work around it. We get what we need to get done. What was extra about the critically reflective approach here was communicating that workaround. So we had parents saying, when the clinician tells me we need to give your child a diagnosis in order to access these supports, I know you don't want the diagnosis. I get that that comes with all kinds of unintended consequences. So we'll put the diagnosis back on the shelf once we've accessed the supports. And just that extra bit of communicating the workaround made a huge difference to families. And finally, noticing inequities. This is key. This is the key ingredient to critically reflective practice, where we had practitioners and families talk about how the system was such that it works well for some. It also can work if you become the so-called squeaky wheel, and that's ultimately not just. That's not fair. That's not right. Not everybody can or should become that squeaky wheel. Not everybody falls into line with the way the system is set up. And ultimately, noticing those inequities required attention to power, which we will keep coming back to, because without considering power and addressing power, it is simply not critical reflection. Importantly, with critical reflection, as opposed to related concepts like reflexivity, the focus is on material sites for social change. One material site in the context that I've been describing is reports and letters that practitioners write and create and document things like diagnoses and supports. Critically reflective practitioners actually made change to these material objects, these letters. And they made these changes to work around the system, to achieve justice, to find the compassionate solution for the person in front of them. So what exactly are we changing and transforming? What is the social change that is happening? If we go back to those opening questions and why I think education, in fact, can help solve some of these most complex challenges in healthcare, critical reflection, by definition, aims for transformation from inequity to justice, from a lack of trust to trusting relationships, and from scarcity to collaborative workarounds that do help get things done in a way where people feel supported. So, how does all of this differ from simply teaching something like the social determinants of health? This is not my area of expertise. Like, I really am quite focused on critical reflection and critical pedagogy, and we have wonderful scholars around the world and thinkers and clinicians and doers and activists who do this type of work. So I want to make sure that we draw attention to some of them here. So Sharma et al. Has talked about how the concept of social determinants of health means that as educators, we end up talking about poverty, but not oppression, race, but not racism, sex, but not sexism, and homosexuality, but not homophobia. And that the current approach to the social determinants of health may constrain or even incapacitate the ability of education to achieve the very goals it lauds and in fact perpetuate inequity. Those are Sharma et al.'s words. Carmen Black from Yale University has talked about how we can establish meaningful collaborations with less focus on retaining power or voice or hierarchy, and more focus on building meaningful partnerships with people from epistemic perspectives not our own. And when structuring a reading list for a course, for example, we can look outside our traditional set of readings so that we do not reproduce the belief that all knowledge is a certain thing. It's all white, it's all Western. And the additional piece that Carmen Black adds here is that if we talk about social determinants of health in the framing that Sharma has critiqued, we can reframe it as iatrogenic harm. So we can ask ourselves, is it actually a social determinant of health or rather a socially determined harm? And Dr. Black calls on clinicians and professions' responsibility to mitigate their roles in iatrogenic harm by practicing anti-racist evidence-based collaborative care to motivate equity, reduce waste, and improve outcomes. And I just have to correct myself. The previous piece I noted about establishing collaborations with less focus on power, voice, or hierarchy toward meaningful partnerships with people from epistemic perspectives, not our own, is actually from Morag Patton et al. My apologies, I got a little mixed up there. So what critical reflection does is it adds that awareness that these folks are writing about and talking about. So it doesn't position things like social determinants as out there. It actually positions them as things we can act upon and change, and in fact, that we need to act upon and change. So how do we go about learning then, if it's not just about teaching social determinants of health, if we need that critical questioning that Sharma, Black, Patton et al. Have discussed? So in our previous work and the work of Eric Mikulovsky, Rowland and Cooper, we've all found that critically reflective practice is mostly learned in and through practice and through personal experiences and relationships. This is obviously good in one way. We can learn from all kinds of sources. We can learn from our personal lives and from our relationships. And yet we don't want to rely on this within health professions education. We want to be able to prepare people as optimally as we can. So with others, we've pursued ways to teach for it and to continue to refine how we teach for it. I'm going to share two very practical present examples from the University Health Network and collaborators, and both engage with critical pedagogy, which comes from a paradigm of education that is called transformative education, which is not quite the same as what you may have heard about from Mezirow and transformative learning. This is slightly different. This comes from thinkers like Bell Hooks, Paulo Freire, Joe Kincheloe. Our research suggests that this type of pedagogy that I'm about to discuss is important, and yet we need to have clear definitions of the constructs we're talking about, align our education approaches from our purpose to what we're doing, and to partner. So when we're talking about transformative education, critical pedagogy, which is about justice and balancing things out in terms of unequal power relations, we still need to partner with our cognitivist colleagues who are educating for ways of knowing and learning knowledge that can be applied in the future. And from one of the key critical pedagogues, Joe Kincheloe, we see this same message, where Joe Kincheloe said, we cannot simply cultivate the intellect without changing the unjust social context in which such minds operate. Critical educators cannot just work to change the social order without helping to educate a knowledgeable and skillful group of students. Creating a just, progressive, creative, and democratic society demands both dimensions of this pedagogical process. And one of the benefits of working where we do, a real gift of working at this intersection of Cash, Wilson Center, and TIER, is the ability to do this, to do all of it. And so to do that, we need a pluralistic, thoughtful approach to the paradigms of education. So when we think of education that is more behaviorist, more cognitivist, more humanist, or more transformative, we need to draw on them in ways that align with what we're trying to do. And rarely could we exist in one of these paradigms alone and ignore the other. So the examples I'm about to share thoughtfully blend these different paradigms of education. The first comes from a project that we've titled PSW Dialogues, and you can learn more about it at capelearning.ca. So this is a pretty complex model of what we believe is happening, and I'll tell the story. If you start in the pink box, the Public Health Agency of Canada launched a fund whose purpose is in the box below labeled outcomes, was really to ensure all Canadians have access to evidence-based information on vaccination, ultimately improve the health and well-being of Canadians, and in particular, racialized communities in Canada. On the right, in the personal support worker dialogic sessions box, you'll see that we were already working with PSWs. We had strong partnerships. We had nice collaborations, and we decided to build on this and some of our research around the potential of dialogue. And we created facilitator development materials with and for PSWs so that PSWs became the facilitators of dialogic learning. And we did this in partnership with students like Victoria Boyd, who is studying dialogic learning. And what we found by engaging PSWs in dialogue about things like vaccine policies, public health policies, COVID-19, and all that happened with it in relation to them and their work, it was a different kind of education. We weren't there to give them the facts. We weren't there to convince them. We were there to truly listen and hear and share and understand one another. And we did find that. So when a third-party evaluator came in, they found that PSWs expressed a high degree of comfort within discomfort, which is the whole crux of transformative education and critical pedagogy, to get uncomfortable, because there you can learn. PSWs expressed divergent and contrary opinions, which is what we wanted. We didn't want people to feel they had to just repeat back what they were being told. They felt their voices were being heard and amplified, and that we were starting to address systemic barriers rather than saying, I need to convince every single person. A couple of quotes from our conversations with PSWs. To be honest with you, it's always a bit nerve-wracking to speak to people. But once you get going, it's easier because you realize that people share some of the same views and some might not. But as I said, it's all a learning process, and it's about respecting other people's opinion. You might not agree on it, but we're all there for the same common understanding, to find a solution. And another PSW said, I found that we could share our opinions and talk about it because I don't feel that we're asked a lot. There are expectations, but what about us? Nobody talks to us about how we feel or how we should be doing things. And I just want to give due credit here to the team. If you go to the CAPE Learning website, you can see all the partners, many community partners who are involved in this, and the whole UHN team that's been working on this. This is a partnership between TIER and CASH and many of our PSW organizations like VHA Home Healthcare. So this is an example of where transformative education is giving a space for different voices to come together and build knowledge together, rather than telling people what they should think on an issue that is really socially fraught and complex, that touches on the inequity and trust issues that we mentioned at the beginning of this talk. And I'll share another now. So student-led environments. There is one in particular that I want to highlight. So this is called SLEDVAST, Student-Led Environment for Virtual Autism Supports During Wait Times. So what on earth is a student-led environment? And you can see this is led by Catherine Parker, Farah Friesen, Amanda Binns, and a whole consortium from many different organizations. So a student-led environment is something that fills a service or a system gap. There's a real need. So in this particular instance of SLEDVAST, there's a gap in autism services such that kids sit on wait lists for a very long time, not necessarily getting supports they need, while their parents might feel very anxious about, there's something going on and I'm not able to help my child. So there's a clear system gap. And what student-led environments do is they integrate education science, so all the paradigms of education science, as well as experiential knowledge, clinical knowledge, and scientific knowledge about autism and neurodiversity. So what's important here is that this one educational design is helping resolve healthcare gaps because students are leading and learning. And it's doing so while bridging those multiple knowledges we've talked about. So we're not simply teaching students the facts about autism. We're also talking in that critical way. We're talking about neurodiversity. And one of the outcomes of the student leadership in SLEDVAST represents that critical perspective. So they haven't gone in to only support children and families with autism. They're actually designing interventions that target schools. So if we might believe that part of the problem is not the individual with autism, it's society not necessarily being inclusive, accepting, understanding of people who may be considered neurodivergent. If we believe that, then why do we still only intervene on individuals? So what the students involved in this initiative have done is decided to intervene on schools, with classrooms, with teachers to help create more inclusive spaces. So while the students are doing this type of leadership work in partnership with Northern communities, though the students are mostly here in Southern Ontario, they're learning all about the science of autism. They're learning about the critical social science of neurodiversity. They're learning this through evidence-informed education that blends cognitivist and transformative approaches, and they're filling system gaps. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. And a couple of quotes from students that drive home how impactful this type of opportunity can be. One student said, "I didn't used to question anything, like how is language affecting how we're seeing the child and how we're communicating with parents?" And another said, "With the model of education you chose, I knew you were leading us somewhere. And at the same time, I knew I had to figure it out myself. That's what I appreciated. You're your own teacher. You're not spoon feeding us, especially with autism and the things that we're covering. It would be disingenuous and wrong to tell people how to think about these things. You weren't talking about it, but didn't discourage how others felt if others had other ways of thinking about it. You provided reasonings." And finally, a student said, "It's not only weekly meeting times, but times outside of that to think, to digest, to work. It's not just for our credits or anything. There's actually real good discussion that goes on. And I would recommend this to others because it's such a great introduction to feeling a cohesive community between different professions and families. And there are easy credits where you could just go and listen to a lecture. This one takes work and it's worth it." So those are two real-time examples that are happening and unfolding right now as we speak. And you might be wondering, well, does it really work? And so I will share a couple of experiments that I will admit myself as more of a qualitative researcher, transformative educator, really resisted doing. And in partnership with colleagues listed here, like Nicole Woods, Mahan Kulasegaram, Sarah Wright, and others, we decided, okay, let's blend these different knowledges and see what we can come up with. And so I'll share kind of as one story, two studies. One is led by Victoria Boyd. We wanted to see if we could prove in the more typical experimental sense whether these approaches to teaching really make the difference that we're trying to make. So we compared teaching approaches, regular reflective discussion, not bad discussion, reflective discussion, versus this critically reflective dialogue where power is brought in. And the topics in the two studies were around social determinants of health or pediatric disability cases. The students who participated in these studies were interprofessional groups of learners. In the first study, they were in person. In the second study, it was during the pandemic, so it was online. And I share that because we often get questions like, but can you do this online? What we did is we put students through these types of learning. So either the regular reflective discussion or the critically reflective dialogue. And we recorded what they did later in other activities where we had them either listen to something new and talk about it or look at new cases and write mock clinical letters. In both instances, in both studies, we coded for what students later said in that follow-up activity, as well as how. Was it critically reflective or not? And then we subjected our coding to regression analyses. And what we found was consistent in both studies. When groups of learners from multiple professions came together and learned through critical pedagogy, involving criticality and dialogue, they were more likely to speak or write in critically reflective ways in their subsequent learning activity, when compared to a more commonly used pedagogy, the reflective discussion. So just to drive home that what students talked about topically didn't differ, nor would we expect it to. How they did, with that lens of criticality, attention to power and justice, that's what changed, which was the whole goal. And we were, again, trying to intervene on material sites for change. So what the students were doing was changing things like structures or reports or letters to help move from inequity to justice, from a lack of trust to trust, from scarcity to collaborative workarounds. I mentioned that I'm not really talking about transformative learning like Mezirow, which many in education will know. So what's the key difference? What's the key difference between things like that or a more reflective discussion and the type of critically reflective dialogue that we're talking about today? Well, recall that from our past work and the work of Mikulovsky, Rowland, and Cooper, critically reflective practice was mostly learned in and through practice and through personal experiences and relationships. So hold on to that. When you're teaching for critical reflection, there are two prerequisites. One is this idea of epistemology of practice, that there is knowledge in your doing, created through your doing. So this creates a space where your personal experience, maybe somewhere you volunteered or something you've gone through with your family, it counts. We have to create that space because sometimes we can accidentally push that type of knowledge aside like it doesn't count or matter. It's really important. It's a key ingredient to this type of pedagogy. And transformative learning does invite that. It invites the human in and asks critical questions about our experiences. So we're pretty good at this one in general in transformative learning approaches, humanistic approaches to education. The extra layer of the type of transformative education and critical pedagogy we're talking about today is the critical social inquiry. So you need both in critical pedagogy, the commitment to the idea that knowledge can be created, live, and grow within practice, and continually being critical. And when we say critical, we don't mean critical thinking. We don't mean certain types of critical reflection like what, now what, so what, which is one model of reflection that is out there, useful for its purposes, not what we're talking about today. Basically, if you're not thinking about power, you're not doing critical reflection. So power is the distinguishing focus of critical reflection, where we're playing with this idea to help it be easy to remember of power as this sort of mnemonic for remembering and considering power and privilege, oppression, who's benefiting and who might be harmed, emancipation, ethics, and equity, and then resisting the status quo, resisting the power relations we're so accustomed to, and ultimately reimagining another way that things could be. This also requires pedagogies of discomfort that Megan Bowler talks a lot about. It's not comfortable to do this type of work. So another thing, you could say, if you're not thinking about power, it's not critical reflection. If it's super comfortable, it's probably also not critical reflection. And we're going to keep refining this little power thing to help it be more accessible. And you can see the team that is working on this right now. So finally, Stephen Brookfield, who is someone who's written a lot about all of this, reminds us to continually turn the critically reflective process back on itself. Critical reflection, critically reflective practice are not about finding the one right way, the one best way of thinking and talking and practicing, or believing that we're better now. Instead, it's about continually questioning and pushing back on the assumptions that underpin our ways of thinking, of knowing, and practicing, to direct that same curiosity and skepticism that are necessary for critical reflection back at ourselves as practitioners, asking ourselves, how am I gaining power and how is that impacting my work and my motivation for the work? How am I sharing power? Am I willing to give some power up? And if not, who might I be harming? How can I resist that and reimagine another way? So to remain critically reflective, we need to maintain critical about our criticality and hedge against the temptation to believe we figured out the best solution or that even there is a solution. This is what's necessary to mitigate against a sort of predetermined journey from being the oppressed to becoming the oppressor, and instead to reimagine and enact compassionate, equitable, and ethical possibilities. And I look forward to your questions and just have to acknowledge everybody that's been involved in this work, all the co-authors and other influences who were cited throughout, the Praxis Lab, the Excel Lab, the CAPE Learning team, CASH, the Wilson Center, TIER, the university departments I'm a part of, and the funding sources. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stella. I really appreciate it. I've heard you speak before. I haven't heard this version of your presentation before. And every time I hear you speak, there are new pieces that I get to learn. So I very much appreciate that you came and joined us today. We do have a couple of questions on Slido. Again, I'll remind everyone you can pop onto the link. It's on slido.com and you enter 107508 and you can see the questions that have already been provided and you can add your own questions there as well. So we have a question here, Stella, from Michelle Ransom, and Michelle asks, can you tell me more about communicating the workaround? Can you connect that as well to like the individual critical reflection? And following that, being able to critically reflect on your individual perspective and become aware of many perspectives, that this might allow for improved quality of care. So she's seeing the thread, but would like you to unpack a little bit more these two pieces.
Thank you, and hi, Michelle. It's such a great question. Let me try to think through it. So the first part, communicating the workaround, was really interesting because I think all of us practitioners tend to come up with workarounds because a lot of our challenges in healthcare can seem unsolvable if you were to only follow what the typical steps are, what the form allows, what is possible without sitting on a wait list. You know, if you only did that, there'd be just, it'd be so demotivating. So I think workarounds are common and they actually can help restore some hope when people are able to make things work despite the broken system. I think what was special about this finding was when we heard families so appreciate being included in coming up with the workaround and realizing that there was one and feeling like their knowledge counted. So it wasn't that they were being patronized by a clinician or a health professional. They were being included in the process and trusted that, of course, they brought valuable knowledge. And part of the reason the workaround was being communicated was because that knowledge was valued. So in the example I shared, the clinician saying, I hear you, you don't want this diagnosis for your child. I can see why. Here's why we're going to use it. It's a workaround because the system is such that we need it to get what you need for your child. And the whole, you know, we'll put it back on the shelf after is another part of the workaround. Like we don't ever have to talk about it again. We just need to get this for your child. And it may come back off the shelf again in the future if we need to get something else. And the families just really appreciated a kind of flattening of power there where they were being involved in that process. And then in terms of connecting it to individual critical reflection, so I remember a practitioner in that study who everybody talked about this. We called her Dr. Lucy. That wasn't her real name, of course. Everyone talked about Dr. Lucy as doing a lot of these workarounds. Like she just came up with ways to write reports and letters and do things to just make it work for families. And this clinician was highly critically reflective, was aware that the school was not an enemy. They were working with the system too, and that everybody ultimately wanted this good quality care. So I think what's important, and this is another thing Victoria Boyd writes about, is it's not that Dr. Lucy was always critically reflective and that another clinician was not. It's that in moments you can enact critical reflection and in other moments you might not. So it's not that you are or aren't critically reflective, it's that you can enact critical reflection in certain moments. And what's needed to do that is a combination of knowing about power and looking for it in places, and having some domain specific knowledge. And that knowledge can come from life, from practice, from textbooks, from papers, but you still need some type of knowledge about that space to be able to apply that critical reflection to it.
Thank you. And Michelle also added another comment about your acronym for POWER, and she's just a very powerful acronym. So I'll just add that for you. Question about the PSW work, the CAPE learning work. In the PSW sessions, how do they learn to handle fundamentally incompatible perspectives in dialogue? So we've talked a lot about this. So I'm curious, Stella, how do you handle the idea that sometimes, you're welcoming different perspectives, you're welcoming people to bring in life experience, and often that can put you in just direct competition or just conflict with folks. So how do we handle that?
Yeah, I love this question. Maybe Gregory should answer. Gregory Collins, who's one of the organizers of today, because he was also organizing these sessions and attended all of them. This was hard for the team because there were things that were said that you may not just disagree with, you may feel are just completely inaccurate. And it may not even be a feeling, right? There may just definitely be things that are not true. And yet the point of this dialogic space isn't necessarily to, in that exact moment, convince everybody. And if we were to do that, to go in with that as the intention, I'm not sure we would be addressing the trust piece, which is important for the future. So I think that these dialogues are a bit of an investment in a relationship and truly understanding why people hold the views that they hold, and giving a space where it's safe to share these views. Of course, we did provide evidence-informed information during and after the sessions so that we weren't perpetuating misconceptions or myths. Yet it was still important to enable different perspectives to exist in a space. And what we talked about in our facilitator development sessions, where we were preparing PSWs to go and have these dialogues with other PSWs, we talked about being able to picture it as coming together at a table where people are going to say things. If you imagine like a meal with family, friends, neighbors, people are going to say things. And some of them may be a little bit offensive, some may be untrue. There are many different values flying around. And the goal is that everyone leaves that table with a greater appreciation for multiple perspectives. So this is where aligning the paradigm with what you're doing matters. If our goal was to teach the facts about vaccination, then maybe this wouldn't be the best approach. It's not aligned, because then, yeah, people might leave completely confused because they've just heard 10 different perspectives. That was not the goal of this education. So to align it with the transformative paradigm, the goal was to start to create a space that could start to build a relationship toward trust, and to provide some information that people might have become curious about through the conversation. And it's in that information we provided after that there were more of the evidence-informed perspectives. So the facilitators themselves handled the incompatible perspectives by saying it's okay to share things that you might think are controversial. It's okay to share things that are different and that disagree. And the point is not to try to convince one another. So, there are risks to it, and yet we do see it as a longer term relationship building investment.
Thank you so much, Stella. Another question is around, again, what you just mentioned, which is creating spaces for this type of work. So what can we do in education settings to encourage the safe spaces that are required to actually encourage this critical reflection? And what are some ways that students are engaged in what are some ways students are engaged in sharing personal reflections that can really frame some of their interventions in a way that, again, fits this critical lens? I think that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, I think for the first part, what can we do in education to encourage the safe spaces that are required to encourage these critical reflections? I think that the framing matters a lot. So when students come in, they have preconceived notions of what education in our academic health sciences context tends to look like. And so to just launch into critically reflective dialogue might be jarring. And so it has been helpful. This is just speaking from experience. It has been helpful to frame it and say, in this context, we are going to engage in a type of learning where sometimes there is not a single right answer. In other moments, there is a right answer, and we're going to allow for both possibilities, both types of learning, and that we are welcoming, deliberately welcoming you to bring all forms of knowledge to the conversation. And then if you're the facilitator, sometimes really modeling that vulnerability that is required can be helpful. And I also know that it can get tricky. So you can end up having people share things that hurt others, or one person shares something and another person shares something that is invalidating to another student. Yet in one of my most recent examples, which is a fairly large health professions course, we started out by talking about our sort of values and expectations as a learning community. And the students themselves created a description of a space where they would hold each other accountable and kind of call each other out if things were said that were wrong, inappropriate, hurtful, harmful, and kind of try to assume that everyone there was not intending for that, that everyone there was trying their best to learn. And so there would be room to call one another out while also a sort of giving grace to one another if you do slip up and say something that doesn't quite come out the way that you intended. And so in that way, the students created their own expectations for this type of learning. And I will say that group of students is holding us to that initial framing, where every time we deviate and sort of snap back to our old ways of doing education, they remind us, and it's appreciated that they remind us, no, you said this would be a space where we could get into really difficult conversations. And the students have kind of come along with us on the journey.
Great, thank you, Stella. Ann Heasters has a comment, a question around workarounds. Sorry, I'm going to go back to, no, I'll jump here. Sorry, I think we're just out of order on the way we're doing these. But I'm going to jump to the anonymous question here because it's in response to the last one.
Sure.
So how do you handle difficult and challenging learners in a critically reflective space? So acknowledging again that we wanted to have this safe space, allow people to bring in their perspectives. What do we do when we have these kind of situations and you have a learner who's actually quite difficult and might be challenging in that setting? There are just so many power issues involved when we're teaching as we work to develop safe learning spaces.
Yeah, it's a great question. And these are the moments when I wish we weren't broadcasting and could have a whole conversation about it. I don't know the answer. And I think I sometimes go back to the work of Bell Hooks, who writes so beautifully about this and had a lot of this happen in her own educator experience. I do think there's something about facilitating dialogue where it's different than just being critical. So in a dialogic approach, you're not sharing the critical knowledge in a way that you're putting it out there to be picked apart. You're eliciting a way of talking about things that invites people to bring their own perspective to it, but not to assume that we're all equal experts on the same things. And I think I don't know if that's coming across clearly, but I think, so one of the dangers when you mention this that can happen is someone explains their own experience with racism at the hands of healthcare. And someone else says, well, I've had this experience. And it's like a direct invalidation of that. And I think if you set the space up for dialogue in a way that it's not about like a tit for tat or, everybody share their stories because all stories are equal. It's that everyone brings something of value to the conversation. And Bell Hooks writes about this as all of us in this space are to ask ourselves before we share a story, what is this story adding to the conversation and bringing to the conversation so that it doesn't become like a performance of share all your stories because it's some kind of a competition. I think that's when we tend to get the really challenging issues. Then when someone does say something that's just like outright harmful, as a facilitator, you do need to intervene. You need to sort of stop that. And that is hard. I don't have any kind of magic tricks for that.
I think too, like you've acknowledged throughout this entire presentation, that this is not an easy space to work in, right? It's difficult. It's going to be difficult for the educator, and it could be uncomfortable for the learner, right? So you can have learners who come into this space and they didn't sign up expecting the learning itself to be uncomfortable, which could prompt someone to be difficult, to be challenging, which can just, make it really not a safe space when, despite the fact that, the instructors did their best to make it as safe as possible. Okay, so now we'll go to Ann Heaster's question, sorry about that, on the workaround. So Ann has said here that in healthcare, the term workaround often carries a negative connotation, especially in the patient safety culture. This is because workarounds can have unintended negative consequences, and what we really want to do is address the underlying problem or problems at hand.
Yeah.
Has this been considered, acknowledged, or addressed?
Totally. I expected this question. Thank you, Ann. A very important ethical question. I just want to go back to the safe space thing and just give a nod to people who have also written about brave spaces, braver spaces, and accountable spaces. There's a whole scholarly higher education conversation going on in the literature about this. So yeah, the workaround thing, it is fascinating because there is the potential consequence of just keeping the broken, inequitable system going. If we all just keep working around it, we're kind of enablers in that way. And then I've had conversations recently with Tabitha Pramian and in the past with Victoria Boyd, Kinnan, McKinnon, about how a lot of massive social change, structural change, political change starts from on the ground movement and change. So I see both sides of it. I can see how simply doing workarounds and not addressing policy or structure or systems can ultimately be a disservice. And I also think that sometimes for the patient that's sitting in front of you, you have to do the workaround because the systems change can't happen in that moment. So I don't think we can give up on the workarounds. We just need to continually connect the workarounds to that broader systems view and have folks in the policy spaces also making change there. I think it's all connected, and a lot of major social movements have happened from, grassroots origins. So thinking of workarounds as the sort of grassroots of clinicians, yet we do need to sort of shine a light on it and not leave them hidden and just perpetuating the status quo. It is, I'd love to hear what Ann could say about this. It is a huge ethical issue.
Thank you. And again, on the workarounds, another point, you kind of addressed this, but workarounds can also be problematic if they're used to let those with power and privilege attain more of the same. Kind of hit on. Does our system only trust certain people to say their workarounds out loud?
Great question. It's a great question, and I think it speaks to that final slide to maintain that criticality upon our criticality. So we can't pat ourselves on the back and say, I come up with innovative ways to get my patients the care that they need. It's also thinking about how that ultimately might make you feel good in the moment, help your patients in the moment, and be contributing. I'll call myself out. When I was practicing in that space of the story that I shared, I definitely fell into that mode for a time where I found a workaround to diffuse situations. Like I found a way to bring emotions down and have people feel heard. And things would often kind of resolve better as a result. Yet I don't think it was actually sort of getting the care that was needed or fixing the system. I was just making everyone feel better and myself feel better. So, ultimately I went back to school because I felt like that as a workaround was insufficient. I don't know the answers to these questions. And I think the whole point of a critical reflective approach is that we leave with more questions than when we started, and we don't think there is a solution. That's not the point. There isn't one simple solution. And when we do think we've found that simple solution, likely we're perpetuating problems.
Very optimistic way to end this conversation, Stella. Thank you very much. We have reached the end of our question period. And again, it does feel like we still have many more questions and we can keep this conversation going, which tells me that this has been a fantastic and successful lecture. So thank you so much, Stella, for participating. We really appreciate it. To everyone watching, thank you for participating. We are going to be sending out an evaluation form to everyone after today's session. We'd love to get your feedback on how today went. We also would like to hear your recommendations for who else we might invite to Big Ideas. Turning back to our land acknowledgement and many of the things that Stella's raised today, we're hoping that you'll be very inclusive in your thinking on those nominations and help us to think about who from our many different communities can participate in these lectures. Thank you, Stella. Thank you, Gregory, for organizing today's session, to Matt and to all the tech team in the background for helping it run smoothly. I will leave everyone to enjoy the rest of their day, and we will see you next year for our next Big Ideas lecture. Many thanks all.